Today on Science Fiction and Fantasy Network, I'm talking to Zen Cho. She is the author of the award-winning story collection Spirits Abroad, editor of the Cyberpunk Malaysia anthology. She has been nominated for the Campbell Award for Best New Writer, and New Best Writer, presumably. Honour-listed for the Carl Brandon Society Award for her short fiction. Her historical fantasy novel, Sorcerer to the Crown, won the British Fantasy Award for Best Newcomer, and she was the Locus Award finalist for Best First Novel. That is a lot of awards. Zen, thanks for joining us.
Clearly I need to make my bio easier to I've never tried it myself.
So I'm going to start with the Cyberpunk anthology that you edited. How does editing affect your approach to writing and vice versa? Does it change the way you view your own work when you're working on it, thinking, well, how would an editor view this, having been through the editing process yourself?
I mean, it's an interesting question. I actually, when I was editing a Cyberpunk Malaysia, that was about the time that I was going through, must have been the copy edits for Sorcerer to the Crown. And actually what I found was being in copy editing mode for Sorcerer to the Crown was affecting the way I approached editing Cyberpunk Malaysia. And I was in that really picky, mode, which I'm sure is very enjoyable for all the authors whose stories were included. I think, I don't know that it's really affected the way that I approach writing. I think just because you're just in a different position towards your own work than you are with regard to other people's work. I think the experience of revising Sorcerer to the Crown and the experience of editing and going through that editing process was hopefully quite helpful when I came to approach editing Cyberpunk Malaysia, because I sort of had that experience of knowing what my editor had approached my work and the sort of questions you ask and how you try to draw out that author's vision for their story and kind of clarify that. I think it's quite hard to take that logical, objective, editorial mindset and apply it to your own writing. Not least because when you're first coming up with a story, it's just completely different mindset.
I suppose, and also you're dealing with short stories there, which are kind of different to full-length novels.
Yeah. I mean, they're obviously there's obviously common ground in terms of how you approach editing short stories and a novel, but certainly there are challenges that come up with a novel that don't the short story, and vice versa.
What about writing short stories versus writing a novel? How do you approach a story and think, well, this is a short story and this is a novel? Was Sorcerer to the Crown ever in your mind a short story, or was it always a novel?
It was always a novel. Yeah, I think for most people who do both, and mind you, I haven't done a short story in quite a while since I started trying to work on novels more, just because. Not because I don't want to. I would love to do more short stories, just in terms of timing, and the amount of energy a novel takes up. It just takes up a lot of space. But I think most people who do both, I imagine, when an idea comes to them, you kind of know whether it's going to be a short story or a novel, and it's sort of the nature of the idea. I think a short story lends itself much more to that kind of epiphany, or exploring an idea within sort of fairly defined parameters. And with a novel, it's just much more expansive. You just have more space to really delve into world building, into character and plot and that sort of thing. So, I mean, you're a writer as well, aren't you? So. Yeah. So I don't know if you've got the same experience with short fiction versus longer form. Yeah,
kind of. I mean, I hadn't really written a lot of short fiction before I got published, weirdly. I'd always sort of viewed a lot of short stories as kind of part of a larger story, which I don't think is particularly conducive to effectively writing short stories. Having said that, the first thing I ever got published was a flash fiction about a cat. It was based on my own cat who had one eye and was very old. So it was very depressing.
Oh no!
Anyway, talking of, you talked about how in a longer story you can kind of go into characters in a bit more depth. So how do you construct your characters around your story? Like for Sorcerer to the Crown, was like the story kind of the first thing that came along, and then you kind of built the characters around them, or did they kind of go hand in hand, as it were?
I suppose it kind of goes hand in hand, because I think what happens is you kind of get an idea for a story, and then sometimes a character comes along with it, and sometimes just the shape of the story starts to create its the kind of character that you need to act it out. But then conversely, sometimes you just get a really clear character, and they essentially drive the story, and they make it up as they go along. And I think with Sorcerer, I was lucky enough that the two main characters, Prunella and Zacharias, they were pretty clear to me. I had a good sense of them from the very beginning, which is not always the case with all of my stories. But I sort of knew what sort of space they occupied in the world, and I knew what sort of arcs I wanted them to have. And it took a long time to kind of work out what's the best way, what should happen in those arcs and what was the best way to tell that story. But I sort of had an idea, a kind of feel, a fairly clear feel for what I wanted to get to. So I suppose it sort of did come hand in hand for me. I know some people, they come with the plot comes first and the characters come second, or the characters come first. But for me, it's not always consistent. It sort of depends on the story.
What about the sort of periphery characters? Because what impressed me about Sorcerer to the Crown was that a lot of the kind of side characters still felt very much like real people. You have people like Mrs. Daubly and some of Zachariah's friends. They kind of sometimes were a bit sort of larger than life at times, but how did you feel about creating the side characters, and is that a different approach?
Well, I'm really pleased they work for you. I think with the side characters, yeah, I suppose it is a bit of a certain approach, a different approach, because their growth isn't as key to the story. So I think with the main characters, as I was saying, to me the story and the characters end up very intertwined, because you don't have it. I don't think you have any story unless something happens to the characters and they're interesting and the readers get invested in them. And with the side characters, I just had a bit of fun with them. So in several cases I was sort of drawing on other kind of character types that I'd sort of seen in other books and wanted to play with myself. And so, for example, Zacharias' friends Damerel and Rollo are essentially drawn from the kind of types that you get in P.G. Wodehouse books, and they're these sort of the kind of brainless aristocrat and the kind of very smooth kind of character who goes around making jokes. And I just wanted to have fun with them in a fantasy setting, and they grew from that. Where somebody like Mak Gungang, who's the Malayan witch who appears in the book, is a very sort of standard character that I write quite frequently, which is kind of a magical aunt character. Is very overbearing and as you say, larger than life, and that's kind of drawn partly from life, just from all the very overbearing aunts that I know.
I mean, Rollo especially struck me as this is very P.G. Wodehouse, and that's the kind of nicknames a rich upper class person would get if they were that kind of person. So
yeah, absolutely. That
was a kind of authenticity to it. What kind of research did you do into? Because it's set in Regency times. Were you reading a lot of, like you say, P.J. Wodehouse and things of around that era? Yeah,
I mean, P.G. Wodehouse is a bit later, but I definitely read a lot of fiction written about that time, because I think the most obvious kind of source in terms of influence is Georgette Here's Regency romances. So I was reading a lot of those. In terms of research, I read a lot of nonfiction as well. I read a lot of historical nonfiction. I mean, what I found was it was difficult because there are sort of other cultures also featured in the book, although not as prominently as kind of that Regency London setting. The Regency London setting was quite easy to research. There's a lot of writing on it, and there's a lot of fiction about it as well if you want to get more of that feel, and both writing from that period and later on. But I think in terms of trying to find out what it was like in early 1800s China, for example, because you have a Chinese character appearing, albeit briefly, that was a bit more challenging. Try and get sources in English. That was a bit harder. But yeah, so it was a combination of writing from the period, the 1800s, writing that draws from that period, although it wasn't written at that time. So I read Patrick O'Brien and Susanna Clarke and so on, and then non-fiction as well.
I mean, characters like Zacharias and Prunella as well, they face a lot of the prejudices of the time. Was that something you did a lot of research into as well? What were attitudes back then in terms of race and gender?
Yeah, I mean, that is an interesting question. I think I would say more of the research that I did was just learning about the historical Black and Asian presence in the UK. So there's a really sort of magisterial work in the kind of in those areas, Staying Power by Peter Fryer. And at the time, David Olusoga's new book, Black and British, hadn't been published yet, but that would have been very useful for as well. But there's actually quite a lot of writing on particularly the historical Black presence in the UK, and and I read a lot of that. And when you read that stuff, you just get a sense of the attitudes anyway. But I would say in terms of the attitudes and the prejudices that Prunella and Zacharias face, I didn't really research those because I just sort of drew on my own personal experiences. with racism, and I don't think, I don't think the dynamics change that much. I think if you kind of understand how that kind of thinking operates and how people treat each other, when they have those kinds of prejudices, essentially you start to see the same dynamics repeat themselves, and it's quite easy to write it convincingly, when you've kind of experienced it yourself.
And there is something in there that I've recognised quite a lot, which is that especially when you're in a minority of some description, you kind of Zacharias and Prunella have to do this in that in order to be recognised as being on the same level as everyone else, they have to be kind of extraordinary in terms of being 5 times as powerful, let's say, to be considered just as powerful.
Yeah, I think I have 2 thoughts about it. So one thing was that I didn't want them to be extraordinary, and partly it was just the fun of most lead characters in books, especially in genre, are extraordinary in some way, and it's just fun to read about that. And I think so that was a kind of is that kind of fantasy of being really rich and beautiful and powerful, that kind of wish fulfillment. There's a bit of that element, and I just thought it would be nice to have that with with non-white characters. The other thought I had, just in response to your question, is that with Zacharias and Prunella, it was nice having these 2 characters as the focus of the book, because I think I see them as each dealing with the kind of their position in society in a different way. So Zacharias, who's sort of the main character, the Sorcerer Royal, he deals with it by being kind of better than better. He has to be irreproachable, and that's because of the way that he is brought up. He's brought up by 2 white parents who are very anxious for him, who are grooming him for success, and they know he has to operate in this this society that's already looking down on him, and so he has to be kind of perfect, because basically he's going to be facing a lot of crap, and they sort of think he needs to be beyond reproach, and so Zacharias has really kind of internalized that, and you see that in the book. Whereas Prunella, she basically has no parents. She kind of grows up in this really odd position in a school. She's kind of half a servant, half not, and she's much more kind of I'm going to go get it. I don't have any. She doesn't have that burden of expectation in her, in a way. She just deals with all right, people are gonna look down on me, or they're going to be prejudiced against me. So I just don't care about them, and I'll just go get what I want.
You mentioned earlier that a lot of prejudices and prejudice attitudes still exist within modern society. But what about within the publishing industry? From your experience, have you seen it changing towards being more accepting of diversity, not only in the kinds of people who are writing, but the kinds of characters that are being included?
I think there is a kind of growing. I think we're in a bit of an era, aren't we, at the moment? And query whether it will kind of keep going. I hope it does. I think it's a cultural moment. It's not just publishing. You kind of see it across the board, where in the world we are now, it's kind of impossible, I think, to pretend that you're just on your own and you're sort of separate from other cultures. I mean, it doesn't stop people from trying to do that, but yeah. I think it's just easier, with the internet and so on. I think perhaps increasingly equalizing positions of different economies, of different countries, to see that, okay, we are an interconnected world, and people want to reach out to each other, and people want to understand each other more. So I think hopefully publishing is kind of slowly growing to changing to reflect that. I think it is quite slow. I think it looks like somewhat behind the times, but I do see a change. Yeah,
I know there's kind of a instinct amongst a lot of writers who are kind of more conscious of that, to make the villain of the story into the big kind of representation of bigotry and evil. I think of Harry Potter, where how the Death Eaters are essentially I won't put a political
like magic Nazis.
Yeah, essentially. Let's go with that. Was that kind of? Did you ever feel tempted to kind of try and paint the villains of your own work in that kind of light, or were you more kind of concerned with just telling the story as as you saw fit? I
think there's a bit of a the sort of antagonists in my story are kind of they're not precisely like wizard Nazis. They're more like how do I say this, like wizard racist partners in a law firm, or wizard racist MPs, or something like that. Yeah. But so there's a bit of that, I guess. But it wasn't like I explicitly sat down and said, oh, it's going to be an allegory of racism or whatever. It was more kind of, I'd really like to write a really light-hearted story. It's going to have magic, it's going to have a bit of romance, it's going to be set in Regency London, and will have like these two non-white people as main characters, and then and the story just kind of unfolded from there. You kind of start, you think, well, what sort of challenges would you face, and a lot of the world building kind of rose up around it.
I mean, I suppose it's the thing that you write from your experience all the time, and if you're experiencing antagonization from certain groups of people, shall we say, then they're naturally going to be the thing you gravitate towards to making the antagonists.
Yeah, and I mean, and it's not the focus in a way, right? Yeah. Like it's like you just sort of live your life, and you kind of face certain things that depending on who you are and depending on your luck and so on. So I think in the book, hopefully it's like the challenges that Zacharias faces. It's not the the racism, for example, isn't the sole focus. He's also got lots of other problems. Like his dad's really overbearing and hasn't gone around just because he's died, gone away just because he's died, and all sorts of things. The fact that he's in this difficult position of England's losing its magic and so on.
I mean, going back to the magic, I suppose you include a lot of references to fairyland and that whole nature of English magic. It reminds me a little, I'm sure I'm not the first to say it does remind me a little bit of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell at times.
Yeah.
What was your approach to the magical systems in your fantasy? Like, how did you foresee it? Was that, again, something you went into knowing, okay, this is the kind of magic system I want to do, or did you kind of look at the story and say, well, this is the kind of magic I need for the story to work?
More the latter. I think I wasn't expressly thinking of Susanna Clarke's novel when I was writing it. I love Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, but it wasn't kind of top of mind. I was more sort of expressly drawing on Georgette Hare and that sort of thing. But I think when you look at the magic system, it obviously is fairly heavily inspired by, or it's got an influence. It's got a stamp on from not just Susanna Clarke, actually. I mean, just I think the tropes of when people write books about English magic, like Neil Gaiman, Hope Mirrlees. I think it's kind of drawing on that tradition. Harry Potter as well, actually. And there's a lot of kind of like, all right, here's a spell. It's got a specific name. I think it was. I was trying to drive for something a bit scientific as well. So like thaumaturges, i.e., magicians in my book, are English magicians in my book, are uncovering different ways to use magic, and it's almost it's almost like a natural philosophy. So their society is called the Royal Society of Unnatural Philosophers.
I did like that was quite clever.
And to me, I think one thing I tried to show a little bit in the book is that that's not the only way to view magic. So I just think it'd be natural for different cultures and different people. If magic is a fact of like a physical force, like gravity or something, so everyone's going to be aware that it exists. But the way they study it, they might come to different conclusions about it. They might have different ways of working with it. And I think you see that a little bit in this book, and hopefully a little more in the next book.
I mean, that's something I quite enjoy in your book and in Harry Potter as well, is when magic becomes institutionalized to an extent. When you've got departments of government dedicated to it. I always find that incredibly funny, and
it's just fun. Yeah, it's just fun to play around with the kind of bureaucracy of magic, isn't it?
I mean, in some ways you feel like, oh, it's taking a bit of the enchantment out of it to make a bureaucracy out of magic.
Yeah, but that's life. Like, you never have any excitement without red tape.
I suppose it's also kind of, that question that often comes up with fantasy is, if all these people have all these tremendous powers, why haven't they taken over the world yet? And I think, adding bureaucracy into it kind of goes, oh, right, they haven't filled out the right forms yet.
It's just the comedy of the kind of incongruous. You have something that's really exciting, you think operates beyond rules like magic, and then you just have this body of rules. I think it's quite a sort of easy joke to make. Anyway.
Yeah, I suppose you could look at the kind of modern technology we have nowadays and say, well, why haven't we quote unquote destroyed the world yet, or massively? Well, yeah, a matter of times perhaps. But then you go, okay, there is a lot of bureaucracy and systems in place to curtail that kind of thing.
Let's try to pull that back, yeah. Hope.
So you mentioned the second book. Is that what you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, that's right. So I can't say too much about it, but the idea is it's set in the same universe. It will have a couple of new characters or different characters as the main focus. But Zacharias and Prunella do appear, and I'm hoping to explore more, other parts of the world and sort of different views of magic.
When you wrote Sorcerer, were you kind of thinking it as part of a series initially, or was it always a standalone and then you later decided to carry it on? I
think both options are a bit more clear-headed than I was at the time. I essentially just wrote it thinking, oh, I'll finish a novel, and and it was the first novel I queried and so on. So I want to finish a novel that I think is fit to send up to agents and so on, and I was really just thinking about telling that particular story. I suppose if you asked me, so I suppose I essentially wrote it as a standalone, but I just didn't really think of the future at all. And when I went to my agent and she sent it out, she said, "Oh, I'd like to sell it as a kind of 3-book deal." So that's essentially what happened. And I said, "Okay, I'm happy to think of other books to write." In the same universe. So that's how it happened.
So is that something you think that has affected the industry at large, in that you can't kind of approach a publisher with a single book? Or
I feel like you probably could, couldn't you? They are still publishing fantasy standalones, but I think I wonder whether it sort of takes a little bit of courage on the part of the author. So given the industry seems to be trending towards trilogies, and you can see why, from the agent's point of view, from the author's point of view, it's a great thing, and for the publisher as well. I invest in this series. If it takes off, then then you have like future installments, and it's kind of more predictable in a way. But I think it can be sort of a pity in the way. Like I'm really fond of certain fantasy standalones. Like I loved Uprooted by Naomi Novik that came out last year. Or was it the year before? Anyway, recent book. And I suspect, I'm not really sure if I'm going to be writing actually another in the Sorcerer universe after this one. We'll see how I feel after I finish this book.
I suppose it's not a new phenomenon. I mean, you look at something like Dune or Redwall, or these are series that perhaps started as a single one, and then somebody said, "Oh, maybe write more." I mean, I think, was it Dune where the guy said, "Well, I'd finished," and then the publisher kept giving me money. So, I mean, that's the position you want to be in, I suppose.
Yeah, it's not new, but I do think it's kind of a trend at the moment. Like because I was speaking to some authors a while ago at a con, and they were saying, the 90s, for example, they couldn't sell a trilogy for love or money. People just wanted, publishers just wanted standalones. That was the trend. And I wonder whether it's changing a little bit. At least in young adult, I've been seeing more like announcements of duologies, so just 2 books at a time.
Yeah.
Less so than in SFF, but it might spread.
I mean, speaking of duologies, one of the people who was also nominated for the British Fantasy Award for Best Newcomer was Stephen Poore, who's also published by the same publisher as me.
Oh yes, I met Stephen. Yeah,
he's done a duology, which was all right. But yeah, serialization is kind of an interesting thing, and something that you talked about, how it's not. Is it necessarily like a sequel, or it's just set in the same universe?
Oh yeah. I think it's probably more set in the same universe. Although it does show like the kind of further adventures of Pernod and Zacharias.
So it's kind of like spanning that, being both a standalone and a follow-on.
Yeah, hopefully, yeah.
And that's the direction I always wanted to go in it, because I think I seem to recall being told a while ago that, again, the industry might have changed since then, because we're talking like 2006, 2007 now, that publishers would look at trilogies kind of skeptically, because you'd get so many sales for volume 1, then that would be cut by a third for volume 2, and then volume 3 would be a third of the second book sales, and you get this diminishing returns. So this presenting something as both sequel and standalone, perhaps that's kind of come out of that attitude of, oh well, we don't want to take too much of a risk.
Yeah, perhaps. I think that probably does still happen, the diminishing returns thing, from from what I've heard other people talk about and so on. It's like everything in publishing, isn't it? And that it's so hard to say this is, as a general rule, this is what happens, because it just depends. And so some series actually, with each book that comes out, the sales of overall increase, and I assume that's why publishers like series and like trilogies, because you're always hoping for that to happen. But equally, if it doesn't kind of take off in that way, then you get that diminishing returns kind of issue. I don't know if saying the next book is a standalone, even though it's in the same universe, helps at all. But it's just a story that came to me, so that's what I'm going to go with.
So other than the next Sorcerer book, what else are you working on at the moment?
Well, I'm not working on anything else because, as I said, novels just take up a lot of time in my space, in my head. In the kind of like in publishing, there's always these spaces where you finish something and then you have to wait before. So in those spaces, I've been working on a fantasy novella about dragons. I think that's kind of the main thing I've been working on. Sometimes I sort of try my hand at a short story and then but I haven't managed to kind of finish any recently.
And where can people find you online? Let's do the plugs.
Yes, I've got a website, zencho.org, which has lots of information about my stories and my books, and there's links to free short stories as well if people want to try out my work. And I'm also on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as Zenaldehyde. So that's ZENALDEHYDE, and it's a sad chemistry joke because aldehydes are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, CHO, and my surname is Cho.
I do appreciate a good pun, and the nerdier, the better.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much for the conversation. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.